Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe, your trusted place for deep and thoughtful conversations about global issues, politics, and the way our world is changing. I am Adam, and I am very glad to be with you today. Together with my co-host Julia, we are ready to explore one of the most difficult and important questions in international relations: human rights or politics? America's double standards in China. This is not only about the United States and China, it is about the way values, power, and credibility shape the world we all live in.
Thank you, Adam, and welcome to all of you listening right now. We are delighted that you have joined us for another episode of Learning and Discovery. Today's topic is extremely important because it examines a tension that lies at the very heart of global politics. When America criticizes China on issues such as freedom of speech, religious liberty, or treatment of minorities, is this a sincere defense of human rights, or is it a strategy shaped by politics, competition, and national interest?
Exactly, Julia. For decades, the United States has presented itself as a champion of human rights, often using these principles to guide foreign policy. At the same time, critics point out that Washington has supported governments with poor human rights records when it served U.S. interests. China, for its part, often responds to American criticism by pointing to these inconsistencies and arguing that Washington's approach reflects double standards. Understanding this debate is essential for anyone who wants to make sense of international relations today.
This issue matters because the US and China are not just any two countries. They are the two most powerful states in the world, and their rivalry affects trade, technology, global institutions, and even the everyday lives of people far beyond their borders. If human rights become a tool in this competition, then the consequences reach into the international order itself. That is why we must ask carefully, where does morality end, and where does politics begin?
These are the kinds of questions we will explore in this episode. We will look at the history of U.S.-China relations, how human rights entered the dialogue between them, and why accusations of double standards appear so often. We will examine America's criticisms of China, China's responses, and how other countries view this dispute. Most importantly, we will not take sides. Our goal is to present the facts clearly so that you, our listeners, can reflect and decide what you believe.
Before we dive deeper into this fascinating subject, we would like to kindly ask for your support. If you are watching or listening on YouTube, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the English Globe. Your support helps us grow and makes it possible to bring you more thoughtful discussions on politics, international relations, and global affairs. It may seem like a small gesture, but it truly makes a big difference for us.
Yes, and we would love to hear from you as well. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from. Our audience comes from many countries and cultures, and it is always inspiring to see this global community of learners come together. We also invite you to share your opinions on today's topic. Do you think America's criticism of China is based on a genuine concern for human rights? Or do you see it as a political tool shaped by double standards? Your thoughts make this conversation richer and more meaningful.
So once again, welcome to the English Globe. We are very glad that you are here with us, and we are ready to begin a clear, balanced, and professional discussion on one of the most pressing issues in the world today. Stay with us as we start our journey by looking back at the history of US-China relations and the way human rights became such a central point of debate between these two global powers.
To really understand today's debate about human rights and politics between the United States and China, we need to look back at history. The relationship between these two countries has not always been what it is today. In fact, for many years they had almost no direct contact. After the Communist Party took power in 1949, Washington and Beijing were enemies during the Cold War. For decades, the U.S. refused to recognize the People's Republic of China, instead supporting the government of Taiwan as the legitimate representative of China. That changed dramatically in the 1970s, when the United States and China began what is called rapprochement, a process of coming closer together.
The turning point came in 1972, when President Richard Nixon visited China and met with Chairman Mao Zedong. This was an extraordinary moment in diplomatic history. The two countries did not suddenly become friends, but they realized that cooperation could serve their interests, especially because both were concerned about the Soviet Union's growing power. From this point onward, the United States and China gradually built formal relations. In 1979, under President Jimmy Carter, the U.S. officially recognized the People's Republic of China. This established a new era of engagement, with economic ties beginning to grow and political exchanges becoming more frequent.
Even in those early years, human rights was already a sensitive issue. The United States, particularly after the 1970s, had made the promotion of human rights part of its foreign policy identity. Congress passed laws requiring the State Department to issue annual reports on human rights practices around the world. When relations with China began to deepen, this raised difficult questions. Should the U.S. overlook China's restrictions on political freedoms in order to build strategic and economic ties? Or should it confront Beijing directly on issues such as freedom of speech, religious liberty, and the treatment of political dissidents? This tension never really disappeared.
The controversy grew stronger in the 1980s. China, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, had opened its economy to the world, introducing market reforms and encouraging foreign investment. American companies became increasingly interested in opportunities inside China, and trade between the two countries expanded. Yet at the same time, many in the United States, especially in Congress and among human rights organizations, raised concerns about political repression. China remained a one-party state, and those who opposed the Communist Party faced serious consequences. These concerns became unavoidable in 1989, when a dramatic crisis unfolded.
Yes, the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 were a defining moment. In the spring of that year, tens of thousands of students and citizens gathered in Beijing and other cities, demanding political reforms, more freedom, and an end to corruption. For weeks, the demonstrations captured global attention. But in early June, the Chinese government sent in the military, and the protests were violently suppressed. Hundreds, possibly thousands of people were killed. Images of tanks rolling into the square and citizens confronting soldiers shocked the world. For the United States, this was a turning point in its perception of China's political system.
The U.S. government, along with many other countries, condemned the crackdown. Washington temporarily froze high-level contacts with Beijing, suspended some military sales, and imposed limited sanctions. At the same time, though, the U.S. faced a dilemma. China was too important to isolate completely, both for strategic reasons and for economic opportunities. After some months, dialogue quietly resumed. Still, the memory of Tiananmen Square became a symbol of China's human rights record and remained a recurring point of reference whenever the U.S. criticized Beijing in later years.
This leads us to the debates in the 1990s about trade policy. At the center of these debates was the issue of Most Favored Nation status, often called MFN. In simple terms, this status gave China normal access to trade with the United States at the same tariff levels applied to other countries. Every year, Congress and the President had to decide whether to renew it. After Tiananmen, many members of Congress wanted to make MFN conditional on human rights improvements. They argued that the U.S. should not reward China with economic privileges while it continued to restrict political freedoms and detain dissidents.
This annual debate became very intense. Human rights groups, labor unions, and some members of Congress pushed strongly for linking trade with human rights. They believed that America's economic leverage could pressure China to reform. On the other side, business groups, many economists, and some officials in the executive branch argued that trade should be separated from human rights. They said that engagement, not isolation, would gradually encourage change inside China, and that cutting trade ties would harm US companies and workers. Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton both struggled with this dilemma.
President Clinton, in particular, faced criticism for how he handled the issue. During his 1992 campaign, he strongly condemned the Chinese government for its record on human rights. But after becoming president, he eventually decided to de-link MFN status from human rights in 1994, meaning that trade access would no longer depend directly on political reforms. This decision reflected the belief that economic engagement was the best path forward. Yet it also fueled accusations of inconsistency or double standards, because critics said the U.S. was prioritizing business interests over its moral principles.
Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, the role of Congress and advocacy groups remained very strong. Members of Congress regularly held hearings, passed resolutions, and used public platforms to call attention to issues such as the treatment of Tibetans, the imprisonment of dissidents, and restrictions on religious groups like the Falun Gong. Non-governmental organizations and advocacy groups lobbied for more pressure on China. At the same time, presidents, whether Democrat or Republican, often balanced these demands with the goal of maintaining a cooperative relationship with Beijing on trade, security, and other global issues.
By the early 2000s, the U.S.-China relationship had become even more complex. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, a step strongly supported by the U.S. government and business community. This integration into the global economy made human rights linkages more difficult. At the same time, though, human rights reports, congressional hearings, and advocacy campaigns ensured that the issue never disappeared. Each new administration had to decide how strongly to raise human rights concerns with China, and how to balance those concerns against strategic cooperation on issues like terrorism, nuclear non-proliferation, and later climate change.
So when we look at the historical background, we can see a clear pattern. Human rights has always been part of the conversation between the US and China, but it has also always been in tension with economic and strategic priorities. The Tiananmen Square crisis made human rights a permanent issue in American policy toward China. The annual MFN debates in the 1990s showed how difficult it was to balance principles with interests. And the continuing involvement of Congress, advocacy groups, and the executive branch has kept the debate alive. This history helps explain why the topic of double standards remains so central today.
Exactly. To understand today's accusations of double standards, we need to remember that this is not a new phenomenon. From the very beginning of the U.S.-China relationship in the modern era, Washington has struggled to reconcile its image as a defender of human rights with the reality of its strategic and economic goals. And China, for its part, has consistently rejected outside criticism, framing it as interference in its sovereignty. These dynamics were set in motion decades ago, and they continue to shape the relationship today. Now that we have explored the historical background, it is time to move into the core of our discussion, the human rights discourse itself. When we talk about U.S.-China relations, human rights has always been one of the most visible and contentious issues. The United States has, for decades, criticized China on several recurring themes: the situation in Tibet, the treatment of ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, the political freedoms in Hong Kong, the question of censorship and internet freedom, and restrictions on religious practice. Each of these areas reflects broader questions about rights, sovereignty, and international responsibility.
Let us begin with Tibet. Since the Chinese government established control over Tibet in the 1950s, the region has been a source of deep conflict between Beijing and international critics. US officials and human rights organizations have long expressed concern about restrictions on cultural expression, limitations on religious freedoms for Tibetan Buddhists, and the exiled position of the Dalai Lama, who remains a symbolic figure of resistance. For Washington, Tibet became both a moral cause and a diplomatic pressure point, though Beijing has always insisted that Tibet is an internal matter, rejecting any outside interference.
Moving to Xinjiang, the debate has become even more heated in recent years. Reports from journalists, academic researchers, and advocacy groups allege large-scale detentions of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in so-called re-education centers. Critics say these involve forced indoctrination, restrictions on religious practices, and heavy surveillance. The U.S. government has labeled these policies severe violations of human rights, with some officials even using the term genocide. China, in response, has argued that its actions are part of counter-terrorism measures and poverty alleviation programs, portraying them as necessary for security and development.
Hong Kong is another focal point. For many years under the one country, two systems arrangement, Hong Kong maintained freedoms that were not available in mainland China, such as freedom of speech, an independent judiciary, and open media. But over the past decade, especially after 2019, protests and Beijing's introduction of the national security law have changed the situation dramatically. US officials and advocacy groups argue that Hong Kong's political freedoms have been eroded, while China maintains that stability and national security are more important than political protests that, in its view, threaten order.
Beyond specific regions, censorship and internet freedom have become recurring themes. American policymakers often highlight China's system of digital control, blocking foreign platforms, filtering online speech, and monitoring social media. From the U.S. perspective, these restrictions contradict the idea of free expression as a universal right. Chinese officials respond by saying that every country regulates media differently, and that their model is designed to protect social harmony, prevent destabilizing rumors, and preserve cultural values. This debate reflects not only political differences, but also different philosophies about information in society.
Religious freedom is also central. Washington has repeatedly criticized China for restricting the practices of Christian groups, underground churches, Tibetan Buddhists, and Muslim communities. Reports point to tight registration systems, surveillance of congregations, and punishment of unauthorized gatherings. China responds by emphasizing that religious practice is allowed, but it must be regulated by law and consistent with national unity. This illustrates the larger divide. The United States frames religious freedom as a fundamental individual right, while Beijing frames it as something that must be balanced with state authority and collective security.
To sustain these criticisms, the U.S. relies on certain institutions. The State Department produces annual human rights reports, which detail conditions in nearly every country, including China. These reports are widely cited by scholars, journalists, and advocacy groups. Non-governmental organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International also play a central role, publishing independent investigations and testimonies. Their reports document alleged abuses and provide data that U.S. officials frequently reference in speeches, congressional hearings, and policy debates. Together, these institutions shape the narrative of China's human rights record.
In addition to reports, legal frameworks matter. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or ICCPR, is often used as a benchmark. The United States highlights the fact that China has signed the treaty but has not ratified it, meaning it is not legally bound by its provisions. This allows Washington to argue that China is avoiding full accountability. At the United Nations Human Rights Council, debates frequently occur where U.S. representatives and allies criticize China's practices, while Beijing defends its record and gains support from countries that prioritize sovereignty and non-interference.
China's responses are grounded in three main arguments. First, sovereignty. Beijing insists that human rights are an internal matter, not something for foreign governments to judge. Second, cultural relativism. Chinese officials argue that human rights must be understood in the context of different traditions and stages of development, not as a one-size-fits-all model based on Western values. And third, the principle of development first. China maintains that improving economic conditions, reducing poverty, and raising living standards are the most important forms of human rights. Political freedoms, they say, are secondary to stability and growth.
This development-first approach has strong resonance within China. For decades, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty through rapid economic growth. Chinese officials frequently point to this as proof that their human rights record should not be judged only on political freedoms. They argue that food security, healthcare, and education are themselves fundamental human rights, and that Western countries too often ignore these dimensions. From this perspective, Western criticism looks selective and one-sided, focused on issues that reflect political ideology rather than the full picture of human well-being.
Still, the United States emphasizes universality. American policymakers argue that certain rights, such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and protection from arbitrary detention, are not optional and cannot be dismissed as cultural preferences. To Washington, rights are inherent and universal, applying equally to every individual, regardless of culture or level of development. This philosophical divide explains why debates are so heated at international forums, with each side accusing the other of misunderstanding or misrepresenting what human rights mean. It is not only about facts, but also about competing worldviews.
What makes the situation even more complex is that many other countries are watching this debate closely. In UN bodies, developing nations often side with China's sovereignty-based argument, while Western democracies usually support US criticism. This global split means that the human rights discourse is not only bilateral, but also part of a wider contest over the meaning of international norms. The result is that human rights debates often become highly politicized, serving as a stage for larger power struggles rather than neutral discussions about universal values.
So when we look at the human rights discourse between the United States and China, we see recurring patterns. Washington raising concerns about Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, censorship, and religion. Institutions like the State Department and NGOs documenting these issues. International treaties and councils serving as arenas of debate, and Beijing responding with arguments of sovereignty, cultural differences, and development priorities. None of these elements are new, but they continue to shape the relationship in ways that affect both policy decisions and public opinion around the world.
And it is precisely this ongoing, unresolved tension that makes the issue of double standards so relevant. Both sides claim legitimacy, the United States as a defender of universal rights, and China as a sovereign nation emphasizing stability and development. Whether one sees this as a clash of principles or a clash of interests, the fact remains that human rights discourse is one of the most enduring and difficult dimensions of US-China relations. It frames not only how governments interact, but also how societies perceive each other, often with deep mistrust and suspicion.
As we move deeper into today's discussion, we need to face one of the most controversial questions. Why does the United States appear to apply human rights standards selectively? When we examine U.S. foreign policy over the past decades, we see a pattern where Washington criticizes rivals like China for rights violations, yet often softens its approach when dealing with allies or strategically important partners. This raises the accusation of double standards, and it is important to analyze how politics, security, and economics influence these choices.
A key example is Saudi Arabia. Despite long-standing reports about restrictions on political freedoms, the lack of women's rights until very recently, and high-profile incidents like the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the US has generally maintained close ties with Riyadh. The main reason is clear. Saudi Arabia is one of the world's largest oil producers and a critical partner in Middle Eastern security. Energy markets, arms sales, and counter-terrorism cooperation mean Washington has strong incentives to prioritize strategic interests over a consistent human rights stance.
Egypt offers another case. Since the 1970s, Egypt has been a major recipient of U.S. aid, particularly military support. While American officials occasionally express concern about political repression, crackdowns on protests, or restrictions on free press under leaders like Hosni Mubarak or Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, aid has continued. The justification is Egypt's role in maintaining regional stability, upholding the peace treaty with Israel, and cooperating on counterterrorism. Again, we see how U.S. policy tempers its criticism when a partner is vital to its security calculations.
Pakistan also illustrates selective criticism. For decades, Pakistan has faced accusations of democratic backsliding, limitations on press freedom, and issues regarding minority rights. Yet Washington has often viewed Pakistan through the lens of its strategic importance, especially during the Cold War and later in the War on Terror after 2001. Its geographic position near Afghanistan, its role in intelligence cooperation, and its influence on regional stability meant that U.S. leaders often balanced human rights concerns with the practical necessity of partnership.
These examples highlight a central truth. Strategic interests shape the U.S. approach. Oil, security, and trade often override a consistent application of human rights principles. Critics argue this undermines America's moral authority, making its criticisms of China or other rivals look less about universal values and more about political convenience. Supporters, however, say that international politics is inherently about balancing ideals with practical needs. They argue that while human rights matter, governments cannot ignore the realities of energy supply, military alliances, and economic security.
Domestic politics also play a significant role. Congress, for instance, has historically been more vocal on human rights than the executive branch. In the 1990s, debates about linking trade relations with China to human rights conditions often originated in Congress. Lawmakers respond not only to moral concerns, but also to public opinion and pressure from advocacy groups. Meanwhile, presidents frequently prioritize stable foreign relations and strategic goals, which can create tension between branches of government over how strongly to criticize partners or rivals.
Party rivalry adds another layer. Republicans and Democrats both invoke human rights, but sometimes in different ways. A Democratic administration might emphasize multilateralism and international institutions, while a Republican administration might link human rights to broader arguments about freedom and security. Yet both parties have, at different times, downplayed human rights concerns when national interests demanded. This inconsistency often reinforces the perception abroad that the U.S. uses human rights as a tool of diplomacy rather than as a universal principle.
Public opinion matters too. When high-profile events, such as the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989 or the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, dominate headlines, American leaders come under domestic pressure to respond. But when human rights issues occur in less visible ways, they often receive less attention, allowing policymakers to maintain close ties with allies. Advocacy groups and media coverage can therefore amplify or mute the importance of human rights in foreign policy, shaping whether leaders act on principle or pragmatism.
From an academic perspective, this debate touches on two key theories of international relations. Realism argues that states act primarily in their own interest, focusing on power, security, and survival. From this viewpoint, it is natural that the United States prioritizes oil supplies, counterterrorism cooperation, or economic ties over consistent human rights advocacy. Human rights become a secondary concern when vital national interests are at stake. Realists see double standards not as hypocrisy, but as the unavoidable logic of global politics.
Liberalism, on the other hand, stresses the role of international norms, institutions, and cooperation. Liberal theorists argue that human rights should be a consistent pillar of US foreign policy, both because it reflects democratic values and because it contributes to long-term global stability. In this view, inconsistency undermines America's credibility and weakens the very norms it seeks to promote. Liberals argue that by prioritizing alliances with authoritarian states, Washington risks legitimizing repression and eroding the international human rights system it claims to defend.
This theoretical divide helps explain the tension in U.S. policy. On one hand, realpolitik requires dealing with the world as it is, building alliances even with governments whose domestic practices conflict with American values. On the other hand, the liberal tradition insists that values and interests should not be separated, because long-term peace and prosperity depend on the spread of rights and democracy. This unresolved debate plays out in every administration, influencing how forcefully the U.S. addresses human rights violations abroad.
For China, these inconsistencies become a powerful rhetorical weapon. Chinese officials often point to America's close ties with countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt as proof that Washington's human rights discourse is selective and politically motivated. They argue that if human rights were truly universal, the US would apply the same standards to allies and rivals alike. By pointing out these double standards, Beijing seeks to weaken US moral authority and frame criticism as interference rather than principled advocacy.
It is important to recognize that this is not just a question of morality, but of credibility. If the U.S. wants its human rights criticisms to be persuasive internationally, they must appear consistent. Otherwise, other nations see them as instruments of strategy rather than sincere commitments. This does not mean that strategic interests can be ignored. No government can afford that. But it raises the question of how much compromise is acceptable before values lose their force. This tension remains at the heart of American diplomacy.
Ultimately, the politics of double standards remind us that international relations are rarely simple. Human rights matter deeply to many people, but so do security, trade, and energy stability. The United States faces constant choices about when to elevate one value over another. Sometimes it criticizes rivals harshly, while treating allies more gently. Whether this is seen as pragmatic diplomacy or moral inconsistency depends on one's perspective. Either way, the debate reveals why human rights remain such a contested and politically charged issue in US-China relations.
Now that we have examined how double standards shape U.S. foreign policy, we need to turn the lens inward and ask a difficult question. What about America's own human rights record? This is not just an academic issue. When Washington speaks out against China on matters like Xinjiang, Tibet, or Hong Kong, Beijing often responds by pointing to America's domestic shortcomings. To have credibility abroad, a nation must also confront its own challenges at home. Let us consider some of the most pressing issues that continue to raise international concern.
One of the most prominent challenges is systemic racism. Despite progress since the civil rights movement, racial inequalities persist in education, housing, healthcare, and employment. The killing of George Floyd in 2020 and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement showed the world that discrimination and police brutality remain unresolved problems. International observers, including the United Nations, have raised questions about how a country that experiences such deep racial divisions can effectively promote human rights standards globally without addressing its own structural inequalities.
Closely tied to racial injustice is the issue of mass incarceration. The United States has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, with around 2 million people currently behind bars. A disproportionate number of them are African American or Latino, leading critics to argue that the justice system reflects systemic bias. Scholars and advocacy groups highlight harsh sentencing laws, the war on drugs, and limited access to rehabilitation programs as causes. For many outside observers, This undermines America's claim to be a leader in protecting civil and political rights.
Immigration detention is another area of scrutiny. The United States has long presented itself as a country of immigrants, yet its policies toward undocumented migrants and asylum seekers are controversial. Detention centers, including facilities for children, have faced criticism for overcrowding, inadequate medical care, and lack of transparency. International organizations, such as Amnesty International, have condemned these practices, calling them violations of human rights obligations. Images of children separated from their families at the US-Mexico border continue to haunt America's reputation abroad.
Guantanamo Bay also remains a symbol of human rights concerns. Opened in 2002 to detain suspected terrorists, the facility has been criticized for indefinite detention without trial and allegations of torture. Despite repeated promises to close it, Guantanamo still holds detainees today, 2 decades after its creation. Human rights groups argue that this undermines the rule of law and contradicts America's long-standing commitment to due process. For many critics, Guantanamo Bay is one of the most visible examples of how U.S. actions fall short of its ideals.
These domestic challenges have not gone unnoticed internationally. The United Nations Human Rights Council has often highlighted America's shortcomings, from racial inequality to treatment of migrants. Reports from organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International frequently include extensive sections on the United States itself. Allies and adversaries alike sometimes question whether Washington can credibly champion global human rights norms while facing such severe issues within its borders. This gap between principle and practice remains a persistent challenge for U.S. diplomacy.
The question of credibility is central. Can a country with serious domestic human rights concerns legitimately lecture others? Supporters of U.S. engagement argue that no nation is perfect, and what matters is the willingness to address problems openly. In the United States, civil society, courts, and a free press play vital roles in holding power accountable. Critics, however, claim that these mechanisms are not enough, and that America's domestic failures weaken its ability to pressure countries like China. For them, reform at home is essential for credibility abroad.
China often highlights these contradictions in its diplomatic rhetoric. When Washington criticizes Beijing over Xinjiang, Hong Kong, or censorship, Chinese officials respond by pointing to systemic racism, police violence, or Guantanamo Bay. State media frequently frame American criticisms as hypocritical, portraying them as politically motivated rather than principled. By shifting attention to U.S. problems, Beijing seeks to neutralize Washington's moral authority and argue that every country should choose its own human rights path without foreign interference.
This diplomatic exchange illustrates a deeper contest of narratives. The United States emphasizes individual rights, civil liberties, and the rule of law as universal standards. China emphasizes sovereignty, development, and stability, while pointing out that Western nations also struggle with inequality and injustice. For audiences in the global South, these competing narratives are especially powerful. When America's own shortcomings are visible, China's argument that human rights are relative and culturally specific gains more resonance. This complicates the global conversation.
Still, it would be simplistic to argue that America's domestic issues erase its international influence entirely. Despite flaws, the U.S. maintains vibrant democratic institutions, active civil society organizations, and mechanisms of accountability that do not exist in many authoritarian systems. The visibility of protests, debates, and reforms, however incomplete, demonstrates openness. Some scholars argue this capacity for self-correction strengthens America's credibility because it shows that the country acknowledges its problems instead of denying them. The issue is whether such self-reflection translates into policy changes.
The balance between self-criticism and external advocacy is delicate. On the one hand, Washington cannot ignore human rights violations abroad simply because it has its own challenges. On the other hand, failure to address domestic injustices undermines its ability to lead. The tension becomes especially visible in debates with China, where each side points to the other's weaknesses to deflect criticism. The outcome is often a stalemate. Accusations exchanged, but little progress made toward improving human rights conditions on the ground.
For global audiences, this raises important questions. If the United States wants to remain a credible voice on human rights, it may need to demonstrate more progress domestically, whether through reforms in policing, prison policy, immigration systems, or detention practices. Otherwise, critics abroad can continue to dismiss US statements as politically motivated. At the same time, ignoring international abuses because of domestic flaws risks leaving victims without support. This is the balance America must navigate as it engages with China and the world.
Ultimately, the debate about America's own record reveals the complexity of human rights diplomacy. It is not simply about identifying flaws, but about how those flaws affect perception, credibility, and influence. U.S. shortcomings do not mean its criticisms of China are invalid, but they do weaken its ability to present itself as a universal model. For listeners, the key takeaway is that human rights debates are not one-sided. They involve competing claims, competing narratives, and competing examples, both positive and negative, on all sides.
As we conclude this section, we must remember that acknowledging America's own human rights challenges does not diminish the importance of addressing abuses elsewhere. Rather, it reminds us that no country is above scrutiny and that universal standards require honesty from everyone. For the US, the challenge is to align its global advocacy with genuine reform at home. For China, the opportunity is to decide whether it engages with these debates constructively or merely uses them as a shield. For the rest of the world, the reality is that both powers shape the conversation in ways that affect us all.
To understand this debate fully, we need to look not only at American criticisms of China, but also at how China itself frames the conversation. Beijing does not simply reject human rights discourse. It presents its own version of what rights mean and how they should be protected. The Chinese government consistently emphasizes stability, economic growth, and poverty reduction as the foundations of human dignity. From its perspective, the right to development is the most important human right, without which other freedoms are not sustainable.
This argument has been central to China's narrative since the late 20th century. After decades of turmoil, poverty, and instability, Beijing highlights its achievements in lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty as proof that its approach works. Officials frequently point out that China's rapid development has provided better housing, healthcare, and education for ordinary people. In speeches at the United Nations and other forums, Chinese representatives frame these accomplishments as evidence that their model of governance protects the population in tangible ways.
For China, the priority is clear. Collective well-being comes before individual political freedoms. Leaders often argue that Western definitions of human rights are too narrow, focusing on civil and political rights while ignoring economic and social rights. By stressing development first, China presents itself as offering an alternative pathway for countries in the global South. Many developing nations, struggling with poverty and instability, find this message appealing. For them, the promise of improved living standards can seem more urgent than abstract guarantees of free speech or political participation.
Another cornerstone of China's stance is the principle of non-interference. Beijing maintains that every country has the right to choose its own political and social systems according to its history, culture, and circumstances. From this viewpoint, foreign governments should not dictate internal affairs or impose external standards. Chinese leaders frequently accuse the United States and its allies of using human rights as a pretext to meddle in sovereignty. In their telling, issues such as Tibet, Xinjiang, or Hong Kong are internal matters that outsiders have no legitimate authority to criticize.
This principle of sovereignty has deep historical roots. China often recalls the century of humiliation, a period of foreign invasion and interference from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century. That memory shapes today's insistence on independence and resistance to what it perceives as Western interference. For Chinese policymakers, sovereignty is not just a legal concept, but an emotional and historical one. By framing human rights criticism as a continuation of past domination, they rally domestic support and reinforce the idea that resisting foreign pressure is essential to protecting national dignity.
Beijing also frequently points to American shortcomings as a way to counter criticism. When the US raises concerns about Xinjiang, Chinese officials respond by highlighting systemic racism, police brutality, and gun violence in the United States. When Washington speaks about censorship, Beijing references mass surveillance programs in America. The goal is not necessarily to claim superiority, but to argue that no country is free from flaws. By exposing US weaknesses, China seeks to undermine Washington's moral authority and present its own record as relatively defensible.
This strategy is not limited to diplomatic statements. Chinese state media consistently frame U.S. human rights criticisms as hypocritical and politically motivated. News outlets such as Xinhua and the Global Times often highlight protests, racial tensions, and social unrest in the United States to show that Washington is in no position to lecture others. These stories are presented not only for domestic audiences, but also for international readers, especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. By doing so, China challenges the idea that the U.S. is a universal model for human rights.
Domestic media narratives in China also serve another purpose: strengthening social cohesion at home. By portraying US criticism as biased, hostile, and even as part of a broader strategy of containment, Chinese media encourages citizens to rally around the government. When human rights debates are framed as an attack on China's sovereignty, many Chinese people see defending their government's stance as synonymous with defending the nation itself. This reinforces a sense of patriotism and legitimacy for the ruling party, even among those who may privately question certain policies.
Chinese officials also use international forums to promote their vision. At the United Nations Human Rights Council, China often emphasizes diversity in development paths and calls for dialogue rather than confrontation. It highlights its contributions to peacekeeping, poverty reduction, and global development initiatives like the Belt and Road. In this way, Beijing attempts to reframe human rights not as a narrow Western standard, but as a broad concept that includes economic growth, security, and cultural values. This approach resonates with countries that feel judged or marginalized by Western powers.
Critics argue that this narrative avoids accountability for abuses in Xinjiang, Tibet, or Hong Kong. Yet, from Beijing's perspective, these policies are part of a broader effort to maintain stability and prevent separatism or terrorism. Officials frame them as security measures that ultimately protect citizens' rights to safety and development. By placing stability at the center of rights discourse, China shifts the debate away from individual liberties and toward collective order. This inversion challenges the liberal idea that freedom must come before stability.
The clash between U.S. and Chinese narratives reflects a larger debate about the universality of human rights. The American position emphasizes universal civil and political freedoms, while China promotes a more relativist approach tied to sovereignty and development. Both claim legitimacy, and both point to the other's shortcomings as evidence of inconsistency. For listeners, the important point is that these competing narratives are not only about policies, but about worldviews, about what it means to live with dignity, and who gets to define that standard in global politics.
As we close this section, we should remember that China's perspective is not just defensive, it is also aspirational. By framing development and sovereignty as central to human rights, Beijing is offering a competing model for how nations can structure their societies. Whether this model gains wider acceptance will depend not only on China's policies, but also on how convincingly it addresses criticisms of repression and censorship. What is clear is that the human rights debate is no longer one-sided. China is actively shaping the narrative, and the world is listening.
As we move forward, it becomes clear that human rights debates between the United States and China are not only moral or legal questions, they are also deeply intertwined with the strategic competition between these two global powers. Issues like trade, technology, and military alliances are often framed in the language of human rights. This intersection means that moral discourse can be used as a tool to advance national interests, raising questions about whether critiques are genuinely principled or politically motivated.
A striking example is the US response to Chinese technology companies, particularly Huawei. While Washington cites national security concerns about data privacy and espionage, human rights rhetoric often accompanies these sanctions. Officials point to China's surveillance practices in Xinjiang or restrictions on freedom of expression to justify actions against Huawei and other firms. Critics argue that human rights language is used strategically to legitimize economic and technological containment, illustrating how moral arguments are sometimes blended with geopolitical objectives.
Trade wars also reflect this pattern. Tariffs, export restrictions, and investment bans are often justified in public statements as promoting fairness, protecting intellectual property, or supporting ethical practices. Yet beneath the surface, these measures serve to check China's growing economic influence. By connecting human rights narratives to economic measures, policymakers can frame strategic competition in moral terms, making it more palatable domestically and internationally. This illustrates the blurred line between values and interests in great power rivalry.
Security alliances are similarly affected. The United States often emphasizes human rights when strengthening partnerships in the Asia-Pacific region, Europe, or the Middle East. Support for Taiwan, military cooperation with Japan and South Korea, and joint initiatives with other democracies are sometimes framed as defending democratic values and freedoms. Human rights then serve not only as a moral justification, but also as a way to align like-minded countries against perceived threats from authoritarian powers like China.
At the same time, the Global South has a nuanced perspective. Many developing countries watch U.S. criticisms of China with skepticism. While some agree on the importance of human rights, others perceive American rhetoric as selective and self-serving, particularly given Washington's own domestic challenges. These nations often weigh moral claims against practical considerations, such as trade benefits, development assistance, and investment opportunities offered by China. This perspective complicates the notion that human rights alone can drive international alignment.
For example, African and Southeast Asian countries have welcomed Chinese infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative, despite U.S. concerns about governance and labor practices. Leaders in these regions often argue that Beijing respects sovereignty and provides tangible development benefits without imposing political conditions. From their perspective, U.S. human rights critiques may appear opportunistic, targeting China to protect strategic interests rather than advancing universal values. This perception shapes how alliances and partnerships are formed in a multipolar world.
Balancing values and interests is perhaps the most difficult aspect of great power rivalry. The United States wants to uphold ideals of freedom, democracy, and human rights, but it must also safeguard economic and strategic advantages. China seeks to protect its sovereignty and development model while projecting influence globally. In practice, both countries face trade-offs, and human rights discussions become intertwined with broader calculations of power, security, and influence. This makes moral arguments inseparable from geopolitical strategy.
It is also worth noting that human rights can be both a tool and a constraint. When wielded skillfully, these issues can justify sanctions, rally allies, or shape international opinion. Yet they can also provoke backlash if perceived as selective or hypocritical. For policymakers, the challenge is to navigate these competing pressures, maintaining credibility, defending interests, and avoiding accusations of instrumentalizing human rights purely for political gain. The fine line between principle and pragmatism is constantly tested in US-China competition.
In essence, human rights have become a key instrument in the broader chess game of great power politics. They provide moral legitimacy to strategic actions, influence alliances, and affect global narratives. At the same time, they can be questioned or contested, particularly by countries that feel targeted or marginalized. Understanding this dynamic is essential for anyone trying to grasp the complexities of contemporary international relations. Human rights are not merely ethical concerns. They are entangled with power, competition, and diplomacy.
For our listeners, the takeaway is that the discussion around human rights in US-China relations is never purely about morality. Each country uses these issues to frame its own actions, justify policies, and manage perceptions. Global audiences interpret these debates based on their own experiences and interests. In many ways, human rights have become a language through which states communicate strategy as much as principle. Recognizing this helps us see why criticisms are both potent and contested in today's international order.
As we reflect on this, it is clear that human rights are both a bridge and a battlefield. They can inspire cooperation, set international norms, and guide ethical diplomacy. But they can also be leveraged to achieve strategic objectives, limit rivals, and protect national interests. In the US-China rivalry, every human rights statement carries multiple layers: moral, political, and strategic. For students of international relations, analyzing these layers is key to understanding not only policy, but the global balance of power itself.
Finally, this interplay between values and interests reminds us that international relations are complex. States rarely act on principle alone, and moral arguments are often inseparable from strategic calculations. Recognizing the dual role of human rights as both a genuine concern and a tool of competition provides insight into the current and future trajectory of US-China relations. This perspective will guide us as we examine how allies, rivals, and the global community respond to these debates in the next section.
As we examine US-China human rights debates, it is crucial to consider how other countries and international institutions respond. Not every nation aligns neatly with either Washington or Beijing. In many cases, global reactions are shaped by a mix of economic interests, historical ties, and domestic priorities. The European Union, for example, has often expressed concern over human rights in China, particularly regarding Xinjiang and Hong Kong, but it does not always follow the US lead. This nuanced approach highlights the complexity of international diplomacy.
The European Union frequently emphasizes multilateralism and diplomacy. While it has imposed sanctions on Chinese officials over human rights abuses, the EU also maintains strong trade relations with China. European leaders often frame their statements as promoting dialogue and engagement rather than confrontation. In this way, the EU balances moral commitments with pragmatic considerations, seeking to uphold human rights standards without jeopardizing economic ties or broader geopolitical stability.
The United Nations provides another important forum for international reaction. Debates at the Human Rights Council regarding Xinjiang and Hong Kong have showcased the divergence of opinions. Some countries openly support U.S. criticisms, condemning alleged abuses, while others, often in the global South, defend China's sovereignty and emphasize non-interference. These discussions reveal that the UN is not simply a platform for universal condemnation, but a space where geopolitical alignments and development interests influence positions on human rights.
Asian nations, for example, respond in ways that reflect regional dynamics and strategic calculations. Japan and South Korea often align with US critiques to varying degrees, particularly in matters related to democracy and freedoms, but they also prioritize stable economic and security relations with China. Meanwhile, countries like Pakistan and Cambodia publicly defend China, emphasizing sovereignty and development. For them, human rights issues are intertwined with investment, trade, and regional stability, rather than purely ethical concerns.
Africa presents a similarly complex picture. Many African nations have benefited from Chinese infrastructure projects and loans under the Belt and Road Initiative. Leaders in these countries often appreciate China's emphasis on non-interference and tangible development outcomes, contrasting it with what they perceive as conditional aid or moralizing from Western powers. As a result, many African states approach human rights debates cautiously, weighing economic benefits against ethical considerations and choosing to remain neutral or to advocate for dialogue over condemnation.
Latin America also demonstrates diverse responses. Some nations openly criticize human rights abuses in China, aligning rhetorically with US positions, while others emphasize economic cooperation with Beijing. Countries that rely on Chinese investment for energy, infrastructure, or loans often adopt neutral or muted stances. This pragmatic approach reflects the reality that for many developing nations, development priorities and economic growth are often more immediate concerns than engaging in high-profile human rights debates between global powers.
Global civil society adds another layer of influence. International NGOs such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch actively report on conditions in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, shaping international awareness and public opinion. They provide documentation, organize campaigns, and pressure governments to take action. These organizations often act independently of state interests, offering a voice for human rights that is not always aligned with either Washington or Beijing, and giving ordinary citizens a platform to engage with global debates.
Social movements and transnational networks also contribute. Activists, journalists, and academics from various countries analyze human rights issues and share information through media, conferences, and online platforms. These networks can amplify marginalized perspectives and influence policymakers by drawing attention to abuses or inconsistencies in state behavior. For example, campaigns highlighting US domestic issues in relation to its foreign criticism of China encourage governments and international organizations to consider both sides before taking positions.
Neutral voices often advocate for multilateral engagement, dialogue, and evidence-based policy rather than taking sides. They argue that condemning one country while ignoring systemic problems in others undermines the credibility of international human rights efforts. By promoting balanced approaches, neutral actors, whether governments, NGOs, or academics, seek to prevent human rights debates from being co-opted entirely as tools of geopolitical competition, emphasizing that ethical concerns should be global rather than partisan.
For listeners, this underscores the reality that international reactions are rarely black and white. Countries, organizations, and civil society actors must navigate competing interests, principles, and pressures. Neutral voices play a critical role in bridging divides, advocating for constructive engagement, and keeping the focus on human dignity rather than political advantage. Understanding these perspectives helps us see the broader international context of US-China human rights disputes and the challenges of building consensus in a multipolar world.
Ultimately, this diversity of responses demonstrates that human rights debates are not solely defined by the actions of the United States or China. They are shaped by complex interactions among nations, institutions, and civil society. Allies may diverge, developing countries may remain cautious, and NGOs may push for accountability, creating a dynamic environment where moral arguments, strategic interests, and diplomatic realities intersect. Recognizing this complexity is essential for understanding global human rights discourse today.
As we reflect on this, it becomes evident that international reactions are a mixture of principle and pragmatism. While some nations align with human rights values, others prioritize stability, development, or economic growth. Neutral voices remind us that ethical concerns must be considered alongside political and strategic factors. In the next section, we will examine how the media and public narratives in both the United States and China further shape perceptions, adding another layer to this intricate global conversation.
As we reach the conclusion of today's discussion, let's take a moment to summarize the key points we have explored. We began by looking at the historical background of U.S.-China relations, from rapprochement in the 1970s to the current climate of strategic competition. We discussed human rights criticisms from Washington regarding Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and censorship, as well as China's responses emphasizing development, stability, and sovereignty.
We also explored the concept of double standards in international relations. The United States has sometimes downplayed human rights concerns when strategic interests were at stake, while China has highlighted U.S. domestic challenges to counter criticisms. We examined how allies, the European Union, the Global South, and civil society actors react in nuanced ways, showing that there is no single universally accepted approach to these debates.
One of the most important lessons is that human rights and politics are deeply intertwined. Moral concerns, strategic interests, economic priorities, and security calculations all influence how states act and what positions they take on the global stage. These debates cannot be reduced to a simple narrative of good versus bad or right versus wrong. Instead, they reflect the complexity of international relations in a multipolar world.
For our listeners, this complexity presents both a challenge and an opportunity. It challenges us to avoid simplistic assumptions and encourages us to engage with global affairs thoughtfully. At the same time, it offers the opportunity to analyze real-world examples of diplomacy, strategy, and ethical reasoning, which can help us understand the interplay between values and interests in international politics.
We also encourage you to reflect critically on some key questions. Can human rights ever be separated from politics? When nations critique one another, are they guided primarily by principle or interest? How will U.S.-China relations evolve in the coming years, particularly when it comes to balancing ethical concerns with strategic priorities? These are questions without easy answers, but thinking about them sharpens our understanding.
This discussion is not only about international relations, it is also an opportunity to practice English. By following the dialogue, analyzing the arguments, and considering the vocabulary and sentence structures we use, learners can enhance their listening, comprehension, and critical thinking skills. Global affairs provide a rich context for language learning, and today's topic illustrates that perfectly.
In closing, we hope that this conversation has given you a nuanced view of the human rights debate between the United States and China. It is a debate filled with history, accusations, counter-accusations, and ethical dilemmas. There is no single narrative that captures everything, and understanding these complexities requires attention, reflection, and curiosity.
Thank you for joining us on this journey today. We encourage you to continue exploring these issues, to read widely, and to discuss them with others. By engaging with global affairs and practicing English simultaneously, you are building skills that will serve you in multiple dimensions: linguistically, intellectually, and as a global citizen.
So, dear listeners, let us leave you with these reflective thoughts. How can nations uphold human rights while navigating strategic competition? What lessons can be drawn from the U.S.-China dynamic? And how can we, as learners and global citizens, Approach these debates with critical thinking, empathy, and curiosity.
Once again, thank you for listening to the English Globe. We hope this episode has been both educational and thought-provoking. Keep reflecting, keep learning, and remember that understanding the world, its politics, ethics, and language, is a journey that never truly ends. Stay curious and engaged, and we look forward to exploring more topics with you in future episodes.